during the live stream. It's really great to have all of you, whether you came to us through Main Street Journal or Neighborhood Economics or Impact Alpha, or anywhere, any of the other organizations that we partner with here. We're really grateful to have you here to learn with us, really is the goal of this whole conversation. So welcome to another edition of Community Capital Live. This is a joint venture between some really great organizations that I want to make sure we represent here first. And that includes, as I mentioned before, the Main Street Journal, which is the hub for local investments and local investment opportunities. We also have Neighborhood Economics, which is an organization that does really, I think, the best at convening impact investors along with the neighborhood organizations that can help support the social impact investing that they are facilitating. We also have the Eagle Market Streets Development Corporation, which is itself a community fund located in our backyard here of Asheville, North Carolina. We have Impact Alpha, which is kind of the place to go for news and updates on impact investing. And then we've got my radio show, The Mindful Marketplace, on Biz Radio US, which talks about social entrepreneurship, models of community and worker ownership, as well as local and community investing. So let's get into it today. I'm pumped today. We have on both Micha Josephy and Josie Shagwart from the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast. So thank you for both of you for being on here today. I do just want to mention our panel, and then we'll get into the discussion here. So our panel today is Kevin Jones of Neighborhood Economics, and also the co-founder of SOCAP Impact Investing Conference. We also have Jasmine Francesca, who is here from the Eagle Market Street Development Corporation. I am Joel Skeen from the Mindful Marketplace, and we are unfortunately missing Michael Schumann today. We do love having him on here as well. He's normally with us here from the Main Street Journal. So let's get into it with Micha and Josie. I appreciate both of you guys. Now, you guys mentioned before we came on, you're a little different than a lot of the funds that we've talked to so far, because a lot of these funds are new ventures that have happened recently. But it sounds like the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast has been around for a little bit. I'm wondering if you could fill us in a little bit on the history and why it came together.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and share space. So Cooperative Fund of the Northeast, which we often call CFNE, was founded in 1975. So it's a few months older than I am. It was founded at a time when the food co-op movement was growing, right? Food co-ops were springing up around the Northeast, around the country, and existing food co-ops, some of which date back to the Depression, were expanding. And the challenge that they were facing was that the shared ownership structure that's inherent to co-ops meant that personal guarantees, credit score reviews, these very traditional small business finance tools for underwriting, they wouldn't work for co-ops. So co-ops would go to banks, would go to credit unions, and couldn't get capital. So they kept going to this local foundation based in Boston called the Haymarket People's Fund, asking for grant capital. And the leader of the Haymarket People's Fund at the time, George Pillsbury, recognized that food co-ops were businesses. They can make debt payments. They just needed debt that was structured appropriately for the co-op model. And so they were able to connect some of the foundation's wealthy supporters with the co-op developers to solve for this problem. And out of those conversations came the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast. Over the years, we've expanded from financing just food co-ops to financing all sorts of different types of co-ops, worker co-ops, so democratically owned worker-owned businesses, housing co-ops where the tenants own the housing, as well as food co-ops where the community that shops at the grocery store owns the grocery store.
Yeah, that was my first introduction to co-ops. Were housing co-ops at colleges and food co-ops. It does seem like food, like there's something about food that seems very it makes it easy for a lot of people to understand these concepts when you bring it back to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the real value that co-ops bring to local communities is in community control of critical economic infrastructure, right? Housing, food, jobs. when those are owned by private equity, when they're owned by investors, who knows where those investors live, then those investors are likely to make decisions that might benefit their bottom line, but don't necessarily benefit the users of those enterprises or the local communities. And so by really closely tying ownership with usership in a local community, you can get much better decisions that that work for everyone.
Absolutely. So bring us up to date then since 1975. What is it when you guys think about the big rocks in your organization of what you are moving and shaking on right now? What does that look like?
Yeah, so there it's a really interesting time. We have experienced a lot of growth just in the past few years. Our growth trajectory over the past few decades has been that we've been doubling in size roughly every 5 years. And growing from a $5 million fund to a $10 million fund looks really different than growing from 25 million to 50 million, which is where we're at now. A lot of that growth has been as a result of the pandemic, where during the pandemic, folks could not meet their own economic needs individually, right? Rugged individualism broke down. And so there was a lot more excitement and really essential need for working together to meet those core economic requirements. So that meant that over a couple of years, our loan volume doubled. Our staff has grown from 6 to 15 people between 2020 and now. And so just managing that growth is both really exciting and a big challenge. We are an entirely virtual office. We were before the pandemic. And so that both gives us some flexibility, but also some challenge around culture building. And then I think one of the other big rocks that we're trying to push is really around racial equity. This is a conversation that we've been having for almost 10 years. And whereas historically, we were really solely a lending organization, right? When I was hired in 2019, I was the first full-time non-lender on staff. What that means when you're entirely a lending organization is that you need folks to be able to get to a certain point in their business development in order to come to you and access your services. And when we're talking about reaching communities that have experienced centuries of wealth extraction, where systems have been set up for them to fail rather than to help, then we need to be thinking about how can we move to where they're at and then engage, moving down the path jointly. So we've been doing a lot of program development, education, et cetera, to be more impactful across the region.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from Josie too on kind of her role in this, but also, anything she'd like to add to what we were just talking about.
Thanks. Well, my role at CFNE is as the capital and culture manager, which, as CFNE being a nonprofit, ultimately, that's how we're structured as an entity. Some of us wear many hats, so I split my time between working with our investors, doing investor relations, investor cultivation, et cetera. And I also work on workplace culture initiatives, which for us means certain aspects of our HR, because as Micha mentioned, we're really striving to reflect our values that we want to put out into the world internally. And a big part of that is organizational culture, which is a really specific challenge at a fully remote workplace, as many of us know since the pandemic. So yeah, we're always living and learning our values internally as well as externally.
Yeah. I wanted to kick it over a little bit to our panel here. We want to go to our panel for questions. I know, Kevin, you had a couple of you. I'm sure you're chomping at the bit for. So I'll kick it to you first, and then we'll go from there. You're muted still, actually.
Okay.
There we go. Oh.
Okay. Why? Let's just not touch it. There we go. Okay, thank you. So I went last year, flew up to Manhattan for this big gathering by the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller, but then a lot of other really good foundations were there. Gary Community Ventures, Surdna, Heron, Balmer, and it was all about shared ownership. They didn't talk about cost, but the whole idea of shared ownership and some of these ownership investment trusts and things. And that's not happened before. Those are a lot of the foundations that come to our neighborhood economics events because we gather the folks repairing local economies, doing it in Asheville, North Carolina in November. But they'd never focused on that collectively together. And it was a huge validation. You know, the people with money in the deals were getting other money in the deals. And one of the things that happens at those gatherings is that the foundations sell other foundations to take a piece of their deal. And I was talking to one foundation exec, and her goal was to come back with 25% less of 3 deals that she can showcase to other people. Like, why is it all of a sudden shared ownership now? I mean, you talked about the pandemic, but what else is validating it? Because these are the folks, you know, I was going to Manhattan, you had to put on my serious leather shoes that lace up and all that kind of stuff. And they were looking at this issue, which is, you know, by its heritage was food co-ops. So why now?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting moment right now where we're seeing the confluence of a few things, right? We're seeing the recovery from the pandemic. We're also seeing the growth of younger generations that really came up at a time of growing populism, right? And I'm not a politician. I don't want to go too deep down that road, but knowing that populism can both look very beautiful and very evil.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the kind of community control can have some deep parallels to a lot of the, you know, coming out of Occupy Wall Street on the left, or kind of similar movements on the right. And so ideas that were fringe, you know, 10, 20 years ago
Right.
are now more common because folks who were first experiencing them when they were more fringe have now kind of grown up and matured and have more power and weight in their ability to deploy their ideas.
Yeah. And so I think you're talking
so.
about, oh, go ahead, please, Josie. I was about to ask.
Oh, no, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add, I also think something we talk a lot about at CFNE is the fact that the cooperative model in and of itself is actually more resilient through economic distress, times of upheaval. And this has been something, you know, that very smart academic people have studied. It's also something that we see lived out in the cooperatives that we are in our portfolio and in our ecosystem. And so I know when the pandemic hit, we were kind of prepping ourselves for a surge of interest, because when people have their resources tightened, less access, under duress, you turn to your community, you turn to these kind of time-tested solutions where you can access those resources locally. So
right. You know, during the pandemic, I was on Nextdoor, the app here, and there were folks, you know, trying to buy groceries for some older people. And they were saying, and mutual dependency was new for them, right? And they were saying, well, these old people don't know Venmo and they don't know PayPal. How in the world can we give them the change? And it's like, these old people will write you a check and they'll put it in an envelope and you can bring it back. And then somebody else had to tell them, and when you get a check, you can scan it and put it into Venmo. And so there's this intergenerational mutual aid, and it was a new thing. But do you think, how are you seeing, resilience is a concept, but how did you see more resilience in bad times because of the co-op model? Josie, if you can talk more about that.
Well, I know that one thing that for me was very remarkable, because I'm new to the cooperative sector and to this social investment sector, impact investing world. My background was more in community organizing, fundraising for very grassroots community groups on racial justice, environmental justice. I worked prior to CFNE, I lived in the Middle East and worked with a Syrian human rights group for several years. And so I was used to work that was very, let's say, addressing issues through direct action. And when I returned to the States, one of the things that really compelled me about CFNE and making want to join this team was the fact that what we're working on provides an alternative. It's a solution that's a structural solution to these issues that we organize for. And so one of the things that very much impressed me, not having been in the sector previously, was during the pandemic when restaurants, grocery stores, et cetera, or maybe not the grocery stores, but the restaurants, some of those service industry businesses were closing their doors. We actually didn't see that by and large in our portfolio, and even amongst the restaurants and those service sector groups. And I think for me, that was just really astounding to say these are pretty resilient groups. And I don't know if Micha, you would add any bones to that.
Yeah, I mean, in the worker co-ops, what we see when they hit hard times is that they'll kind of share the pain evenly, rather than having one owner, a bunch of workers. The owner decides, you know, they're done, they close the business, the pain is felt by the workers, right?
Mhm.
Whereas in a worker co-op, they all may realize, yeah, we need to cut expenses, let's all pare back our hours or other expenses evenly across the board. And so it gives that durability and that resilience for the co-op to make it through the hard time to get to the good time at the other side.
Right. And do you see, Project Equity is sort of most known for working with the silver tsunami of boomers who are ready to retire, but these are privately owned businesses and there's not a buyer. In Western North Carolina, they did a study, and there are 14,400 businesses in our 18 county area where the youngest family member is 55, and the kids have gone to college and they don't want the body shop and they don't want the dry cleaner. And so are you seeing that as a reason for this to surge?
We're seeing it hugely, and it's really exciting because it's a way to make co-ops relevant to Main Street mom and pop businesses, right? And so no longer is it like the back to the landers starting up food co-ops in the 60s and 70s, right? But this is the insurance
Right.
company and the lumber yard
Right.
and so yes, I mean, if you look at our worker co-op portfolio, when I came on in 2010, about 8% of our portfolio was invested in worker co-ops. Now it's 35, 40%. And while a lot of that growth has been a large number of smaller startup cleaning co-ops and landscaping co-ops and such, the dollar volume growth in that portfolio is really coming from these larger conversions,
Yeah.
where they're successful businesses, right? Like, do you really want to, I don't know. I think that there's a big discussion to be had around when the only path to cooperative ownership as workers is through a startup. And we all know
Mm.
how painful and difficult startups
Right.
are.
Right.
Then, like, yeah, that's a great opportunity for some people in some times, but we need to be building out other ways to get to cooperative ownership. And the
Right.
conversion opportunity is really exciting and huge.
Right.
And we're doing a lot of work up in the Northeast. We actually have a high density of nationally renowned co-op conversion practitioners with the
Mm.
ICA group, with Vermont Employee Ownership Center, with the Co-op Development Institute. We're working with them and a bunch of other partners to really align how our practice is working so that we can go deeper on worker owner training, so that we can engage economic developers in prospecting for conversion opportunities. And so that we can better tell the story of these opportunities through aligned data collection and storytelling.
And are you finding that the quality and the number of the intermediaries is growing? Because that's really essential for a market to grow.
Yes, I mean, part of the purpose of this collaboration is to help bring in new to the conversion space practitioners who
Mm.
have deep roots in communities where the conversion practice has not historically existed. So let me be explicit. Because USDA funds rural co-op development, in our region, and I believe nationally, there are a lot more resources going to co-op development in rural areas than in urban areas. In
Hmm.
the Northeast, rural areas are some of the whitest communities in the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're really excited about the conversion work and co-op development work that's going on in Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire because it's needed, right? Communities need that. But we're also seeing a lot of Black communities, a lot of Latinx communities who are not able to access those same resources because they're in urban areas. And so through this partnership, we're able to bring in groups like the Boston Impact Initiative, Mill Cities Community Investments, who do have deep roots and experience working with entrepreneurs of color, in order to have a joint conversation between the deep conversion practitioners and the BIPOC
That's interesting.
entrepreneur practitioners.
Yeah. So the expertise has been in the world. We had Boston Impact on a month or so ago. They're such a great group. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
One thing, you've been around a long time, and so you've grown up to 50 million. Your capital stack is really interesting. That it's almost a majority are individuals. And then faith-based groups are nearly equal to foundations. And foundations, by their nature of being kind of oppressive colonial vehicles, I'd love to see them small. And so how have you done that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just hit the rewind button for the 50 years, tell a little bit about how that origin story kind of puts individual investors front and center in our DNA, and then I'll hand it over to Josie to talk a little more about what we're seeing these days. If you remember the origin story, it was high net worth individuals supporting this progressive foundation, working with co-op developers, and food co-ops, are comprised of individuals. So on both sides of the conversation, it was rooted in individuals who are interested in community investment, right? I think, we talk about crowdsourcing these days, it's a term that's come up in the past however many years. Co-ops are like the OG crowd-funded business, because you have all of these individuals coming together, putting in their bit of money. So when co-ops were seeing that we were a way for them to amplify that local community investment, then that also gave a lot of reason and purpose for those community members to invest in us, so that we could then invest in the next round of co-op development and growth.
And so for groups that are newer doing co-op investing, how would you tell them to, and if you look on their site, the capital stack is there. Do you have that where you could share your screen? Because it's pretty exceptional. This is not what most funds look like, their picture of how the money comes in.
Yeah, let me get this up here. It's actually, just as a heads up, it's a little bit outdated. We're working on getting some updates in there for 2023, but it's not largely different to our invest page. So yeah, you can see it's actually closer to 65% as of the end of last year. These numbers, as I said, are a little old. They're from the end of 2022. But when we think about our individual investors, we usually aggregate individuals and trusts, because we have, as you could see at the end of 2022, about 23% of the family trusts, which are usually, decision being made by an individual to invest through that family trust. So yeah, about 65% of our capital stack typically comes from those individuals. And you mentioned the interest in the faith-based and the foundations, and I know the origin story of the faith-based groups as really instrumental, as Micha said, not only to our history, but also the history of most CDFIs and, and the community development finance movement. So I think many of our faith-based investors, you probably know their name or are familiar with them. The foundations, some have been invested in us well before I started at CFNE. And so, I'm not really sure how those relationships developed. Maybe Micha can speak to that. But I do know that while I've been here, we've had a combination of being approached by often smaller family foundations who are interested in catalyzing their money towards community impact. And so they're seeking out, new investment and finding us, and I'm assuming hopefully finding other CDFIs with those programs. And at the same time, we have gotten a little more proactive in reaching out to them to try to say, CDFIs and CFNE are an option.
Okay, that's great. And one final thing, and I'm going to hand it off to Jasmine. I'm sorry I've taken so long, but there's a Jen, if you could do the network graphic now. So this is a picture of the Industrial Commons, which is here in North Carolina, and it follows the model of Mondragon and some of the other Italian cooperatives where it's networks of co-ops. And there's a really interesting book, Assets in Common, that's just gone into case studies, and this is where this graphic comes from. But they're finding that networks of co-ops are collectively, especially if they're place-based, can be the most effective mechanisms, I guess you'd say, to really grow community wealth faster than anything else. And there are for-profit LLCs down there that you can invest in for a return. There's a bookkeeping, it's not a cooperative, it's a for-profit LLC that started with a cooperative. Material return is a recycling of textiles used to be huge here. You know, I'm from Mississippi, so we would always send the cotton here, and our farmers would make 7 cents on the dollars and they would make the other 93. So it's a history here in North Carolina. So material return is recycling of and upcycling of the materials. And it's a really interesting model. Are you seeing more co-ops like that, where there are service co-ops that are helping to create a collective community well-being and thriving?
We're definitely seeing some.
Yeah,
Industrial Commons is an exciting example. Arizmendi, a network
right.
of bakery and pizza shops in the Bay Area, is another exciting example. Evergreen in Cleveland got a whole lot of press. In our neighborhood, Wellspring in Springfield as well.
Yeah.
I think often the challenge is that it's hard to stand up an enterprise that works and that can compete
Mm,
in the market. And so then it takes really special people to not only be able to stand up the enterprise, but to stand up the infrastructure that will clearly make the path forward a lot easier, as we've seen
mm,
from Mondragon, from Arizmendi. Um,
right.
but you need the right orientation to make that
Right.
work.
Poder Emma is a co-op that's a network here. It's immigrants buying the land under their trailer parks, and they've got service co-ops now and commercial real estate and those sorts of things, and they're great. Jasmine, are you ready to jump in?
Yeah, I think that's a great transition because that's exactly who I was thinking about is Emma Poder. They're doing a lot of really cool work here in our backyard. And they also have a focus on housing co-ops. So I'm curious, can you talk about how the structure for housing co-ops can be a tool for creating more affordable housing and as a tool for fighting gentrification? And going back a little bit to the characteristics of your clients, do you find that there is almost like an educational or racial divide with people understanding how housing co-ops could work as a tool to fight gentrification?
Great questions, and a lot of if I forget one of your questions, feel free to remind me. I want to tell a little bit about how I came into this work, because it was through the housing co-op world, right? I first learned about co-ops when I went to college. I grew up in a kosher keeping household, and the only kosher dining hall on my campus was a co-op. So I joined the co-op movement for the chicken, right? And here I am now. When I graduated school, I moved back to Boston, where I'm from. In Boston, like growing numbers of communities across the country, is in a perpetual housing crisis. And so I was looking for, how could I take this wonderful experience that I had in a dining co-op at college and apply it to housing, and met up with a few other people with similar experiences. And we launched a housing co-op called Boston Community Cooperatives. When we needed financing, we discovered the CFNE, and we got a mortgage from CFNE, right? So I came into this world of finance as a borrower. And so did our deputy executive director, so did our program director. So we definitely bring that borrower experience into our work. we work with a number of different types of housing co-ops. Certainly the resident-owned communities, like the cooperative trailer parks that Emma is working on. We work with Rock USA and Rock Capital to help finance a lot of those up in the Northeast. We also work with a number of limited equity co-ops. So brick and mortar apartment buildings or condos that have resale and income restrictions to preserve the affordability subsidy that helps go in at the beginning of those developments. And then we also work with a number of collective living, what we call group equity co-ops. And that's the type of model that I had developed, where ostensibly you use a nonprofit structure to own the property, but the board of the nonprofit is elected by the tenants. And that model really came up in college campuses during the Depression, where students weren't able to both afford tuition and rent. And so they found a way for these student housing co-ops to own the housing and really minimize cost. So what you see, the rock co-ops are a little different in that there's cooperative ownership of the land, and the trailers, the homes, are owned individually by the tenants. With the limited equity co-ops and the group equity co-ops, you have a bit of a spectrum where there are competing goals that are both great goals. On the one hand, you have preservation of affordable housing, and on the other hand, you have wealth building for low wealth people. And there are only so many dollars when you resell the unit that can go in different places. And so you have a spectrum of how many of those dollars can go into the pocket of the selling owner and how many of those dollars stay with the co-op to preserve the affordability for the next generation. And I think that, brilliant people can have really legitimate debates around how you balance those two needs.
That was actually kind of something that I wanted to ask about was, being on the funding side of cooperatives. It seems like, I've been seeing a lot of news about even how private equity firms are interested in, investing into co-op transitions. They're even some of them are trying to operate their particular private equity firm more in a, equity share kind of model. But it does also seem like there's, sort of, I wonder if you guys run into inherent contradictions in this space, like between the investment side and the cooperative side. And I'm just wondering your perspectives on that interplay.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's, with Stavros, and a lot of the publicity around private equity getting into employee ownership, it's both created a lot of opportunities for conversation and some confusion around the conversation. Folks are coming to the same space from a lot of different perspectives, which is great. I think any employee ownership is better than no employee ownership, and you need to make your gains where you can. CFNE is co-op focused, right? So as an organization, we're definitely pretty far along on wanting democracy, wanting broad access to ownership, not narrow access to ownership. And that's, the deep mission work that we do. And I recognize that not everyone is coming from that place, and I welcome them in, if they have good intentions and are open for dialogue and conversation.
Interesting.
Yeah, Josie, and I know I wanted to see if there's anything recently that you wanted to chime in on.
Maybe not so much. It might be a tangent, but I was going to offer to show a map of where our borrowers are. And I think it differentiates as well between sectors. So you can kind of get a sense of where we are, but also, which are the sectors that we're covering, because at the moment, it's roughly 25% of our loan portfolio is out to housing co-ops and ROCs combined. That's about a quarter of our portfolio. So here it is, and I'll put the the link in the chat here. Find that.
Great. Yeah. I see it
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, that's a lot of coverage all over the whole
Yeah.
Northeast there.
By
great.
number, Josie, what is it? Workers first? Is it in hierarchy? Worker, food, housing? Is that how that goes?
Yeah, you mean in terms of loan quantity?
Right. There are
or
more
number?
worker co-ops than food co-ops than housing.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, Micha, but right now, in terms of loan volume, it's 25% to housing and rocks, about 30% to food co-ops, a little over 30, about 35% to worker co-ops, and then there's a smaller, that remaining percentage is co-ops that are producer co-ops, or I think in some cases hybrid co-ops or nonprofits. We also very occasionally will support a nonprofit if it has democratic decision making or some other quality that makes it cooperatively aligned.
Right.
And it really was only a couple of years ago that worker co-ops eclipsed food co-ops as far as the largest part of our portfolio.
Do you find that that's, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to ask too about if one of the things we always like to talk about on here, and usually Michael Schumann is the one who will bring it up, and so I want to make sure we represent that is as far as in the future, as far as allowing the community members not only to reap the benefits of the co-ops that are in the communities, but to be the investors rather than putting their money just to Wall Street. Are you guys working on ways for non-accredited regular folks to actually be able to invest their money into their local food or worker co-op?
Yeah, we're not only working on ways, but we're doing it. Sorry, Josie, you want to get in on this?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was going to say. We, right now we don't do direct capital raising for our borrowers, but for the money that we need to lend out to them, really, no one needs to be accredited. It's a really accessible investment option. We have investors that range from individuals who have, invested $1,000 with us, all the way up to one individual who recently, through a couple of different investments they made, reached 2 million. So it's a really broad range. I think not huge by some organization standards, but I think really huge given the work that we're doing and the context.
Yeah, I would say that we're registered to sell securities in about half of the states, and you can get that list on our website. So you can be non-accredited, but you can't be in certain states.
I got you. So in certain states, you could, as a regular investor, put money in, but there may be a $1,000 minimum to put that in. Is what it sounds like.
We always have a $1,000 minimum. We find that below that, we like to be an entry point for people into impact investing and community investing, and so we set that $1,000 minimum to make it accessible for a lot of folks. There is a point below which the paperwork costs more than the benefit of the investment, and so that's why we set that minimum.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. We did have a question come in from Ajax Green here, who asked if you support multi-stakeholder co-ops, so where there's investors, employees, and customers all as stakeholders.
We definitely support a number of multi-stakeholder or hybrid co-ops. Generally, investors are not part of the mix, but investing in Fedco Seeds in Maine, which is owned jointly by the workers and the customers, for example. With investors being a membership class, it adds a lot of complication because with co-ops, you really want the users to be the owners and not people who are involved only to derive financial benefit. So often co-ops have a lot of other ways for investors to be involved. I see someone's here from Equal Exchange. Equal Exchange was really a pioneer in being able to bring in community capital in order to augment the workers' capital to capitalize the business. But actually to give investors voting rights, all of that can just get more tricky and raise more questions.
Ajax, did that answer the question you had? Okay, great. Yeah, we love equal exchange. I'm an investor in, your guys. It's so good. Yeah, thank you.
Actually, just personal note about our workplace culture. For a long time, we've been ordering end of the year presents for our staff and our partners from Equal Exchange, and it's like one of the favorite things that comes in season is that box of chocolate or coffee. So very big fan.
Love to be part of this group. Thanks for, I'll bring that all back to the, to the team here. But yeah, I love this webinar. Thanks for being here.
Since we're sharing personal anecdotes, can I just say quickly, Kevin, that
yes.
I used to work at a worker-owned co-op called Firestorm Bookstore here in Asheville, North Carolina, and we were also big fans of Equal Exchange. You definitely kept us caffeinated through our work shifts.
That is one of the best perks of working here, I have to admit. My friends and family are always like, bring home some coffee.
That's funny.
Great to hear it, Jasmine.
Yeah.
Josie and Micah, do you see a difference in the new groups that are doing this, like the Seed Commons that are, they're much newer than you? How are you different from them? What have you learned from them? What do they learn from you?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of groups that are focused on financing co-ops, which both gives me a lot of job security, but also means that there are like limited options for the market and limited capital. So we talk a lot with the other co-op financiers, Seed Common, Shared Capital, Leaf, Capital Impact Partners. So Seed Commons and the working world as sort of the initial brand of Seed Commons really comes at this from some different places, which I think is really additive to the work. We primarily provide debt to co-ops, and I think what Seed Commons really did was help people think a lot more about revenue-based financing and kind of the role for revenue-based financing in very early stage co-ops. So really appreciate that. I think it's also been really interesting to see their innovation around the networks, around having local pods do some of the work and then kind of back office centralized work around raising capital, around training. So I think that local national connection is really interesting. For us, because we're regional, we sort of split the difference on all fronts. We have local loan officers that are deeply rooted in, a particular geography. And then we centralize the capital raise and the underwriting and decision making and all of that. But the diversity that, like the operational diversity and model diversity that Seed Commons brings has been really interesting. And I think one of the differences, since we've been around for so long, you kind of know what you're going to get, which isn't to say that we're not innovating, but we've been around for a long time. I'm really interested to see how these innovations of the Seed Commons play out in 10, 20 years.
They were the ones who did the first investment in Poder Emma, and I was working with Emma at the time. And it was pretty funny. They waited on, and they got a call, and they said, we have the money, and they said, no, we're ready for it. And it turned out that they were already at the building supply place, and by that, before midnight, they had put on a roof. Because immigrants get shit done. I mean, it was just Seed Commons says everybody else was waiting for the transfer. They were waiting at Lowe's for their credit card to be good. So they're such great folks. But the lender doesn't usually get that ready for the money. Yeah. Are there other questions? I think we've really expanded this a lot. That's pretty interesting.
If there's no question that's leaping out from anybody, one other thought that I was having is I do think that CFNE is at a really interesting moment right now in terms of being really rooted in our history, but also you see we have a tagline, funding the future. And, so I think we are innovating in some ways that are, I think, rooted in where we come from. And I think, for example, I don't think we mentioned yet a co-op launch loan product. So
No.
basically in our financial products and in our focus and size of our technical assistance team, who we're calling the learning team, I feel like those are two areas where we're trying to kind of like stretch ourselves. How do we, what's our next 50 years? We had a really solid first 50 years. Now, what does the co-op ecosystem in the Northeast need from us? And what's our appropriate role? We're not community organizers. We're not, we're trying to figure out how can we work to our strengths to serve the ecosystem in the ways that they need.
Are you looking at revenue-based financing and some of the newer ways to do things?
A couple of years ago, we launched a new loan product. We allocated $1 million of our net assets to capitalize a new loan product called the ELF, the Equity-Like Fund. And so what that's done is it's allowed us to be a little more flexible in certain deals to try things like revenue-based financing or 5 years of interest-only payments, much more flexible than our normal, more flexible than conventional finance products can offer. So, we allocated that specific amount of money so that we could learn, so that we can experiment. Yeah, I think just one other experiment that we've been running for the past couple of years is called the Co-op Navigators Fellowship. I mentioned before how certain communities get federal resources for co-op development and others don't. And when that division line falls along cultural differences and history of racism and xenophobia in this country, then we end up with disparities in co-op development capacity in different communities. And so what we've done is stand up a pilot program called the Co-op Navigators Fellowship, where we're funding co-op navigator fellows in 5 Black, immigrant, and Indigenous-led economic development organizations across the region, training those fellows in successful models of co-op development, supporting them to work with their communities to understand where can these models apply and where might they need to evolve in order to better apply, and then working to root those learnings in the economic development organization so that after the fellowship's done, there's still some programmatic capacity there. So really what we see that as is building the pipeline of co-op developers who then build the pipeline of co-ops that need the financing.
Yeah.
So that's part of this funding the future that we're really trying to explore.
Thanks. That's really interesting.
And one other thing I'd add too is just the exponential growth in our learning team who provides technical assistance. Since I came on, it was 1 person. Now we have 4 team members, I think all or most of whom are bilingual, mostly in Spanish. It's just really exciting. I feel like we have a staff capacity right now and an interest to fill gaps in the Northeast cooperative ecosystem around that type of co-op development, because there are, as Micha mentioned, so many incredible co-op development partners, and I think our team is doing a great job finding their niche.
What do you think about the Oberlin model, which is kind of like co-op meets an investment bank?
I think it's really exciting, and I have not been able to dig in deep enough to see how it's going. And so Oberlin, I think of as correct me if I'm wrong, they buy companies, those workers then become part of the member owner structure that governs the collection of companies that they own. And so they're able to think about, do we need some capital capacity? Well, let's go buy a capital company. Do we need some HR? I think that there's an inherent conservatism built into co-op development where you see in the entrepreneur world, you see a lot of innovation, high risk, high reward. I think part of the selling point of co-ops is that the risk is limited and spread, and the reward is there, but it's a lower reward than if you were a sole proprietor. And so I think groups like Oberon, who really are trying to bring a lot more of that aggressive approach to expansion and scale, I think that that's really interesting, and I'm really excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, I love the roadmap. Gosh, what if it were real? You know, that would be great. You know, I want it to be real for damn sure. You know, yeah. So, Jasmine or Joel, do you have other things that you want to be adding?
No, I just you know, I just wanted to say I'm really impressed with the work you guys have done over this, you know, long period of time. And you know, when I see a vision of the future where those communities of co-ops throughout your region and maybe expanded from there can also be funded by the communities themselves. I see a really, and then there's ownership on all sides and state. I think it's a really beautiful and kind of regenerative thing that I'm excited and glad that we got to have you on today. So I guess we'll wrap it up and we'll do a little housekeeping here on just make sure that in order to stay tuned into these, you'll want to subscribe to a few different places where you can get all this info. One of them is the Main Street Journal that we mentioned before. Go ahead and just sign up for their newsletter because if you're interested in this at all, that should be the first newsletter you sign up for. Same, I think, with neighborhood economics and the convenings and conferences that they're putting out and the ways to actually get people convened around these issues. And then to get the archive of Community Capital Live here, go ahead and subscribe to the Mindful Marketplace show on YouTube so that you can actually just be keyed into all the upcoming ones that are coming out. And you can watch those either live on the Zoom or you can watch the recording of all the past ones we had. We mentioned Boston Impact Initiatives. We also just had on the Black Farmer Fund, who's also doing stuff up in the Northeast. So tons of good stuff recently. So go check out the archive and subscribe for the future ones there. Also want to make sure we shout out again Impact Alpha. We are coordinating with them to get this up on their website and their podcast platform as well. That'll be coming in the future too. So make sure to be plugged into all of those. Yeah, and thank you, Micah, and thank you, Josie, so much. Loved hearing your backgrounds, your stories, the work you're doing, and the real transformational work that you guys are doing throughout the whole region.
Much. It was really great to spend this time with you.
Thank you so much
for having us.
Yeah. Until next time, everybody, we'll see you back here. Take care
Thank
of
you so
yourselves.
much.
Take care of someone
Bye-bye.
else.